It's now or never for the Huskies as they travel down to Columbia to take on Dawn Staley in the Gamecocks. You're locked on.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, I want to take a moment to say how thankful we are for all of you. We appreciate all of your support. We're proud to say we're the only daily podcast covering UConn men's and women's basketball, the hoops capital of the world. And we're thrilled to bring you the coverage you deserve and to show that gratitude we're giving back. We're donating 10% of our revenue to Husky Ticket Project, helping send kids to UConn games. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. All right, on today's program, we're going to discuss, is this now or never for the Huskies as they travel to South Carolina to play the Gamecocks? They're not ranked number one. We're also going to talk about USC, UCLA. Is Los Angeles becoming the center of the women's college basketball universe? With that great game, it was a USC upset over UCLA, where Juju Watkins went completely crazy and had 38 points. We're also going to bring in our Friday contributor who's been on a vacation. Hope you had a great time, T. Baker, and they are going to talk about everything, the South Carolina preview, talk about some of the same things that myself and Bella have talked about. But I love bringing in contributors like T because he has a depth of knowledge being a Big East beat reporter. And then on top of it, you know, it's always good to hear from someone other than the host who does this show every day or co-hosts it at least every day. So without further ado, let's bring in T. Baker. T is a Big East, as I said, a Big East beat reporter. He writes for The Next, and he's also a contributor and essentially a columnist for the Hoops Capital of the World Substack. All right, T, welcome in. All right, so without further ado, and fresh from a vacation, let's get T in here. T, I hope you are refreshed from your time away. I know at least you got a little warmer and away from the cold. I think for me, the first question I have to ask you is, talked about this a little bit earlier this week. UConn has not won a top 10 matchup in their last 7 attempts. It's the longest streak in their program's history. Two-part question. What do you think has to happen or has been missing in these big games? And the second part is it kind of now or never for UConn versus South Carolina coming up on Sunday?
Well, hey, Mark, happy to be back. I do have a hopefully nice tan glow from my vacation. Good to escape the weather that's here in the Northeast. So I think as it relates to your first question, the top 10 team wins, I think it's important to look at those in context as well. Like, you know, over the past several seasons, UConn has dealt with a lot of significant injuries that have impacted their ability to have their best players. So I think it's a combination of those injuries and the fact that more elite recruits are going to different schools around the country, right? So it's kind of having, you know, the best players more decentralized across programs, and the best players that have been at UConn have been a bit unavailable the past several seasons. So I think that's my first response, right? And then secondarily,
Sure.
is it now or never? I'm not someone who thinks about things as now or never, really, because I'm, again, a historian of the game. I like to see the way that things become cyclical. And we'll talk a little bit later about UCLA and USC and kind of their past history and how that's resurfacing. But I think these things do go in cycles. I think that it's probably in the never category that UConn gets a number 1 seed in the tournament this year, unless they beat South Carolina. Even if they do, they might have a hard time with that just because their resume is not as strong as some other programs. But do I think that means UConn can't win a national championship? No. I think oftentimes in the championship rounds, when it gets to the later rounds of the NCAA tournament, it's about who has the best player and who shows up. And UConn has 2 of the best players in the country, as far as I'm concerned, in Paige Bueckers and Sarah Strong. And on any given night, they could be the best players on the court. So, I think that the win, I don't expect UConn to win, if I'm being honest, against South Carolina. But I think that either way, they weren't going to be a number 1 seed in this year's tournament.
Yeah, I agree. We did a bracketology segment 2 days ago. And essentially, I said the ceiling is kind of a 2 seed that's away from the best 1 seed, right? So if they were to beat South Carolina, they'd probably stay away. They'd probably actually, I don't know how you feel about this. Notre Dame will probably ascend to be number 1 after UCLA's loss to USC. And then I think it probably doesn't drop UCLA that much. Texas's win over South Carolina actually moved them up a line. So UConn was actually in South Carolina's bracket as kind of like the 3rd 2 seed. So if they were to win this game against South Carolina, I think it would damage South Carolina more than it would help UConn. And
Great.
so I think that would ease the path a little bit to have less. But I also feel like too, it's like if you're one of the better teams, you don't worry about your path. Like I don't think we've ever talked about like, well, if UConn has a good path, they can make it to the Final Four. It's like that's never been an issue.
Yeah.
So this year is kind of the first time that I can remember where that's been brought up. And so I think that's kind of interesting as well. But going back to the games that they've played already, I totally understand what we're talking about but you know this. Fans don't want to hear excuses. They don't want to hear we didn't have Azzi Fudd for Notre Dame. They don't want to hear she was diminished or didn't play that much against USC. They just remember the loss, and they remember the Notre Dame loss being particularly brutal, and remember the USC loss being more heartbreaking. The Tennessee one felt different, though. Do you agree with that? Like that felt like a game where, God, if they just make some open shots. But again, that's another like woulda, shoulda, coulda.
Yeah.
You have to have other people step up. And what do you think has been missing, in particular the Tennessee game where there was no excuses, everyone's healthy, and they had a full complement of their players?
I mean, you said it. They just missed a lot of shots, and sometimes it comes down to that. Had they not missed a couple of those layups, and I don't know what it is lately with UConn. I was at the St. John's game Wednesday, missed a lot of layups. So I'm not sure what's going on.
So
there.
Brutal.
Look, it could if they had hit a few more layups and beaten Tennessee, would we be having this same conversation? That's my question back, I guess. Like,
I think so, because I didn't actually think Tennessee has played some really close games this year against really big time opponents because they're in the SEC, so they get a lot of opportunities. I think the biggest issue I'm having with this team this year, and it's not about I think people mistake criticism for like, being a hater. Like I want this team to win. Every time I'm watching games, I'm with my UConn gear. I want them to win. But when they don't win, I look at little things like the layups, long rebounds, like understanding Tennessee's system of shooting a million threes and shooting, fast-paced jumpers. You got to get a body on someone and get some of these long rebounds. That was a part of it too. They started to kind of take the lead in that game, and then they let it back because there's a lack of attention to detail for stuff like that. And that's not physical, that's mental. Yeah. And it felt the same way about the Notre Dame game with the way how they handled Hannah Hidalgo on screen. So everything you're saying is correct about injuries and full complement of players. But that Tennessee game really crystallized for me that this team needs to kind of find themselves a little bit and be like, you know what, if we're UConn, if we're Connecticut, then we need to do the little things better. Like, what's the quote I say at the end of every show, right? To do things better than anyone's ever done it before. Something similar to that, to Gino's quote. And they're just not doing that. Like, they're not living up to that kind of famous quote from his Hall of Fame speech.
Agreed. And I think that the difference for me in recent years and recent big time matchups is we are used to UConn being the team that intimidates other teams. We're not used to UConn being intimidated and looking a bit shaken and not having the right answers and not having all the pieces in place. And I think that's a new thing for this fan base, is that it used to be that UConn across the chest just kind of won you the game because other teams were terrified, rightly so. I think that now it's different. It's a different ball game, literally. And again, I'm not trying to sound like, the one who's making excuses. I don't think UConn should win every game because other teams are better. And
I agree with that.
Comes down to, and I think that's the key difference. And that has shifted in the past 5 to 10 years. And I think it's compelling, it's interesting, but it's also really fascinating to think about it from the perspective of, can UConn compete in this new era? And I think they're showing that they can, but that there's a growing pain, and they aren't getting all the best recruits. They aren't the top dog anymore, but they are among the top dogs.
Fair enough. All right, when we return, we're going to talk about the big bad South Carolina Gamecocks and what that will look like on Sunday. I said this to Bella. I think this is going to be the highest rated regular season game that you're ever going to see, because it's the first weekend after the Super Bowl. There's no football. It's a 1 p.m. start on ESPN, nationally televised game. We have a lot of eyeballs in this game. So be a fantastic time for UConn to play their best game of the season. We're going to talk about that after the break. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off and you want to bet on the fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking up a player late to hit a clutch three. I never feel like I'm missing my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your one shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports book partner of the NFL. All right, we're back on Locked On UConn here with T. Baker, who's our contributor at the Hoops Capital of the World, and also our co-host on every Friday. Took a couple weeks off, well-deserved. As he said, had a great trip. All right, so South Carolina, I think they're fourth in the country right now. The fourth or no, the second, but they lost to Texas. So they're somewhere in the top four. Let's put it that way, right? When the new rankings come out. What's the first thing that you think of when you think about this game, before we even get into the kind of the players themselves? But just, is it Gino versus Dawn? Like any of that stuff, like pop at you right off the bat?
The first thing, honestly, that came to mind when you asked me the question is that South Carolina's won 71 consecutive games on their home court, and that's where this game is going to be getting played. So that's what we're up against here. I think that it's interesting, the Dawn versus Gino, dynamic. I think it's a little different than it was with Pat Summitt back in the day in Tennessee, Muffet McGraw, Notre Dame back in the day, because Gino and Dawn are kind of from different eras. So it's not the same kind of not the same kind of energy that exists between them. But I think it's really interesting. There's a bit of a conversation happening based on a question that I had asked Gino Auriemma on Wednesday night after the St. John's game, which is, do you think it's a rivalry? Do you think this game has emerged as a rivalry? And Gino is basically like, I think that anytime two competitive teams team up, it has the makings of what could be a rivalry. But he joked that he doesn't think that if South Carolina wins this game, they're going to be printing T-shirts with the score on it, because for them, they have, and this is again a quote, they have bigger fish to fry. They're competing in a three-way tie in the SEC. This is a game outside of their conference schedule. So, I think the rivalry has a different flavor than past rivalries. But I think it's still going to be a great matchup. I think it's two of the teams that are among the most elite in the country. And then that, just a couple of years ago competed for the national championship in 2022. So what comes to mind for me is UConn is entering a bit of a intimidating environment, a place where South Carolina hasn't lost recently. And, if they lose, it hopefully it stays competitive. And if they win, I think it would be a pretty big upset, honestly.
Let's look at the I agree with you 1,000%. Let's look at the matchup of the top two freshmen in the country, in my opinion, Joyce Edwards and Sarah Strong. Tell me the differences between their games and what can we expect from these players on Sunday?
Honestly, I think that Sarah Strong and Joyce Edwards have, emerged, like you said, as the two best freshmen in the class. I think that my experiences with watching Sarah Strong play, I think her game on the perimeter seems to me to be kind of the area where her game is a little bit different. I think from my perspective, Joyce Edwards kind of bodies more in the post. It is going to be playing more of a traditional post role in South Carolina, where Sarah Strong does kind of swing into that role, but really can also be on the perimeter and is that ball handler as well. So I honestly have to see them against each other because I haven't been able to kind of see how they match up one-on-one, but it'd be interesting to see that on Sunday. I think that it's going to be a toss-up, kind of who has the better game. Again, Joyce Edwards is going to be on their home court, so has that confidence. But Sarah Strong, as we've seen, is a killer. She doesn't get shaken by much. So if there's one player who can step into the sort of dog pit, especially as a freshman, and perform, I think it's Sarah Strong.
Let's talk about some of the other players that are going to make an impact in this game. And I'm going to take it from the UConn side first, and then feel free to interject who you think will, who is going to be the impact players for South Carolina. We can obviously go over that. But I made a comment. I want to see if you think this is true. For all the people that want Paige to, including Gino, to be more aggressive, when Azzi Fudd scores 34 points like she did in the last game and has that ability to give them another dimension, albeit against an inferior opponent, I want to see that happen against a South Carolina, against a Texas, against a Notre Dame, who she didn't play against. Can that be the formula? Because for me, Azzi finally felt like she has her legs underneath her, where she does it. Because even in the Tennessee game, she can't just shoot 4 shots. Like, she needs to give me 10 to 11 threes attempted a game. Because Paige isn't going to do it. And I don't mean that as like as a denigration of Paige. Paige's game is penetrate, hit mid-range jump shots, kick to open women on the perimeter, and get her points kind of through the flow of the offense. And Azzi has to be more of that sniper. Do you agree with that? And is that something that we can look forward to in this South Carolina game?
So a couple points there. First, I think it brings me back to what Gino said at the beginning of this year, which is that his best teams have always had a really strong guard, a really strong wing, and a really strong big. You look back at Renee Montgomery, Maya Moore, Tina Charles. You look back at Mariah Jefferson, Brianna Stewart, and Morgan Tuck. He has stated that is the formula. If Paige can be the guard, if Azzi can be that strong, consistent wing, and Sarah Strong can kind of swing in and out of that big role. So I think that is the X factor, and I think we all know that's the X factor. And when I saw Azzi throw up 34 points the other night, it's like, damn, this is the player who she is. This is who was recruited to UConn. I think her challenge has been consistency, consistent health, and consistent performance. I was pleased to see that her first basket was like a drive to the basket, being aggressive. And if that 3-headed monster, so to speak, can be consistent, that is the key for UConn success and to be a national championship team this year.
Does that mean Paige should be more kind of on the ball? Because I feel like she's mixed a little bit of that, right? Because people don't want her to be on ball because they want her to be more of a scorer. But like, it's kind of like, to use a men's basketball reference, like it's kind of like LeBron, right? If LeBron is on the ball and he's facilitating, his teams usually do a lot better. But when he tries to be the guy that's kind of like secondary, where he's a scorer, although he's the all-time leading scorer in NBA history, he's never really been like a primary scorer. Like, he's always wanted to get his other teammates involved. His longevity has made his points go up. So like, I think Paige, in a lot of, probably women from her generation, if they're looking at basketball as a whole, they look at players like that over the years and kind of, market their game after that. She talks about Kobe all the time. She's not Kobe. She may have his mentality, but she's not like a player like him. What are your thoughts on that? Like, I feel like for UConn to, just to your point, to have that kind of triumvirate, that 3-headed monster, you got it. For me, Paige has to run the show, and Azzi has to be the scorer, and Sarah has to be the do it all. Yeah.
Well, who gets the other team's best defensive assignment every night? Paige Bueckers. Who gets double teamed? Who gets triple teamed? It's Paige Bueckers. So I kind of think the strongest role, and again, I am not a basketball coach, but
but you're an aficionado, and that's what we appreciate about you. So go ahead.
But when I start talking X's and O's too much, I get a little out of my depth. But I think she should be
fine.
A player who attracts the defense, leaving other mismatches and players like Azzi Fudd and Sarah Strong more open on the wings to get the buckets they
Right.
need. That's kind of how I see their success, because Paige is going to get the defensive assignment every night of their best player and is going to be the target of the defense.
Totally agree. And to me, it's not saying point guard is not like, I think sometimes people think of it as like, all right, Paige gets the ball and she dribbles it up the floor. No, what I mean is once the offense starts, like once it's initiated, it's thrown through Paige. Maybe there's pick and roll with Sarah where Azzi's flaring out. Maybe there's action to get Azzi off of a screen, but Paige has the ball in her hands. It's not Paige coming off of screens and then her looking for her shot first. She should be looking for, she should always be a threat because, as you said, she's always going to get the most attention. But then playing off of those options, whether it's to Sarah, whether it's to Azzi, and then others who are going to contribite like Ashlyn. I think KK Arnold's been playing great lately. I think she could be an X factor in this game because of her quickness. They're going to need it against South Carolina. All right, let's flip it to South Carolina. We said this on the program the other day. There are stars, but it's like a stacking of talent.
Yeah.
This team has multiple people, like 9 players that average almost 18 minutes a game. So they're deep. Mm-hmm. Give me a snapshot of South Carolina and what should UConn fans, if they haven't really watched the Gamecocks this year, expect to see against their Huskies on Sunday?
I think it comes down to, for South Carolina, just quickness and athleticism at multiple positions. And that starts in the post. I think Ashlyn Watkins isn't available. She's out with a torn ACL. But if you look at Dawn Staley's championship teams, 2017, you had Asia Wilson. 2022, you had Aaliyah Boston. 2024, Camila Cardoso. You have these big posts who dominate, frankly. And I think that you have Chloe Kitts down low, Joyce Edwards. So I think that athleticism and that fierceness starts in the post, but it's at every position. You have Bree Hall. You have Mylasia Fulwiley, who I think is one of the best players in the country. I think she's
incredible.
Yeah, she's a baller. And I think there's been some back and forth about, is she in the starting lineup? Is she not? Is Dawn mad at her? What's going on? I don't follow closely enough to know, but she's a dominant player. And she just, last season's Final Four was one of the difference makers. So you just, at every position, are vulnerable against a team like South Carolina. So that's where it's really a tough team to play. Because, do you plan to play on the perimeter and face defensive assignments like Mylasia Fulwiley, Rava Johnson? Do you put it in the post? I think that's a vulnerability for UConn and has been for several seasons against South Carolina. So it's hard to think about how to scout a team like South Carolina. I think that's what makes them so dominant.
Yeah, I mean, their biggest player doesn't play. Sakama Walker, she's a 6'5" center. I think the difference, and you talked about it, is like even all of their front court is athletic. Whether it's Joyce Edwards, whether it's Chloe Kitts, not unfortunately for South Carolina, Ashlyn Watkins tore ACL. Hopefully she gets better soon and is ready to go for next year. But my thing is, it's a classic South Carolina athletic team. But as you mentioned, like whether it was even just going back 1 year to Camila Cardoso, like there's not that, and I say this not in the sense that it's negative, like a behemoth in the middle who's 6'7", like Lauren Betts at UCLA that you can kind of bank on. They just have a bunch of killers who can get after the offensive rebound. And what has UConn been struggling with? Rebounding. That's why it's such a difficult matchup. So they either have to box everyone out, like box them out into into the bench if you have to,
right? Because
and this team doesn't shoot threes. Like that's the other thing too, is they can do it, but that's not their strength, right? This team is all about putbacks, all about high percentage twos. So it's going to kind of be like an old school matchup here. Mm-hmm. And if UConn isn't careful, they could get their doors blown off because of how fast this team is.
Yeah, agreed. I think keeping it competitive would be a really good sign, and winning would be, I think an upset, like I mentioned. But yeah, I mean, look, South Carolina's fallen 2 times this year, which they hadn't done much over the past 2 years. They had 1 loss between the previous 2 seasons, so they show that they're vulnerable. Maybe they're down to earth. So this could be the year that UConn has a chance at them, but it'll be a tough one, and I can't wait for that matchup.
So last question on South Carolina, and it's more about UConn specifically. what needs to happen, or maybe a better question would be what player needs to step up that maybe you're not getting a ton of production from, that is not like in the norm of the Azzi, Sarah, and Paige. Who is it going to be, and what needs to happen for UConn to get this win?
I think that the player for me that comes to mind is Aubrey Griffin. We saw some good minutes from her Wednesday night against St. John's, had a couple blocks, I think had 10 points. She has been the player who, if healthy, can be an X factor for UConn because she can come off the bench. She can be a dynamic defender. She can just kind of muck things up for the other team. So I think that if she is able to play well, and we've seen her be the X factor in big games before, and Azzi, Sarah, and Paige all have good games, like that's a competitive matchup for me.
All right. You heard it here. We're going to come back after a break and talk about, has Los Angeles become the center of the basketball universe or world? Don't at me. This is a question I'm asking off of an article I listened to and read last night after the game. We're going to talk about that phenomenon after this. Looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating, well, it's easy because you have chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfast, and grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day. We used Factor when our daughter was born 4 months ago, and I couldn't tell you how easy it is for me to just pop in a nutritious meal. In the Protein Plus for me, and I think my wife did the Calorie Smart. Don't tell me why. She was coming off of giving a baby. She could have gotten whatever she wanted. But it kept us fueled throughout the day. The convenience is unbeatable. No prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/lockedoncollege 50 off and use code LockedOnCollege 50 off, all one word, to get 50% for your first box plus free shipping. That's code LockedOnCollege 50 off at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege 50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. All right, we're back on Locked On UConn with T. Baker, contributor of Hoops Capital of the World, and for the next, right? Am I saying that right?
Yep. You got
all
it.
Right. Just want to make sure I get all your credentials down. He's also our co-host here every Friday for the women's show. Okay. Great game last night. USC and Juju Watkins went a little crazy and I think had 34 points last night. She's so good. First off, what did you think of that game? And then I'll ask you the question, is Los Angeles the center of the basketball world right now?
Well, yeah, Juju had just a wild game. To be honest with you, I did fall asleep, so I had to watch some highlights this morning. It's late here on the East Coast. But Juju Watkins, I think, in addition to 30 plus points, also had 8 blocks, if I saw that correctly, with some of whom were on 6-7, 6-8 Lauren bets. So, like, that's just unfair.
She's
at that
insane.
point. Yeah, when you have a player like that.
She's insane.
Yeah.
She had 38 points, 11 rebounds, 5 assists, 8 blocks.
Yeah.
Dumb.
That's just like
dumb.
Heard of. So, like, I got the chance to see her play live in December when she came to Hartford, and she is that player. Like, she is just that good. She's, I think, according to her standards, struggled a little bit, in recent games, but really showed out against UCLA and probably the biggest game so far this season and handed them their first loss. So, just exciting stuff. And whether or not you're a fan of USC, Juju Watkins is a player to be excited about. So, do I think LA is the basketball center of the world for women's basketball? I think that my answer still at this point, in this moment, is South Carolina. I think it runs through Columbia and Don Staley. I mean, they have the Final Fours, they have the championships. I think it's really interesting to me as a historian of the game to see the resurgence of both programs. UCLA women's basketball back in the day had players like Ann Myers Drysdale, who won a AIAW title in the 70s prior to the NCAA taking over women's sports. And then USC, you know, they had Cheryl Miller, the McGee twins. They had some really dominant years as well in the early 80s, and also have some incredible alum like Lisa Leslie and Tina Thompson. So, you know, these are programs that have history and they have pedigree, and I think it's very cool as a fan to see them resurging. But I don't think we can say it's the capital of the world yet until they win a title. Like that's how we measure success in this business sometimes. And so
Sure.
I think one of them has to take home a ring, and in recent years they haven't been able to close the deal.
It is pretty cool though that you have two top 10 programs, one that has been undefeated all year and you know, lost to USC, and also now that they're in the Big Ten. So weird to say that LA teams are in the Big Ten, but either way, I think that's part of why. And it's not my story. Let me. If you guys don't like that, you can go and reach out to the author of the article on ESPN. I'm trying to find his name, but let me see it real quick. It's Paolo Uggetti. So if you didn't like that, go check it out. I read it last night. It's actually an article before the game, but it popped up obviously after the USC UCLA game. But yeah, Juju is insane. She played incredible. I think what it exposes of UCLA is that if you do have a dominant guard that is capable of putting up that type of performance, then UCLA, even with Lauren Betts, who I think she had 18 points, 13 rebounds, and like 8 blocks, she's still a monster down low. You can definitely beat that UCLA team. So, but also that UCLA team beat South Carolina. So it's all matchup driven, right? It's just and that's what we're talking about. Like it's not. There's no there's nothing wrong with UConn per se, but the rest of the world has caught up, right? Essentially.
I think that's true. I mean, I think also that you know, UConn's style of play in recent seasons has been really reliant on guards, and I think that their vulnerabilities show up especially against teams with big post presence.
Sure.
Like even against the USC game, it was Kiki Iriafen, who was, you know, the post player who was able to kind of produce against a more inexperienced player like Jenna Alfie. So I think it's a style of play thing. It's you know, Gino and the Huskies have had a certain style of play as well for several decades now. That's kind of been their winning formula, but other teams have caught on to what that looks like and can adjust to it. And so I think that is part of what's happening here. But I'm excited that USC and UCLA are two teams that are emerging, because I think the history of those programs is really great, and I like to see you know, the alumni that are in the house at those types of games. Cheryl Miller, Tina Thompson, I think we're there. That's just some basketball royalty.
Speaking of basketball royalty, you don't even know this. And hopefully when this comes out later today, this actually, I don't get a cancellation, but later today I will be interviewing Husky royalty in Jennifer Rosati, and we'll put out that show on Monday. So looking forward to that. T, any last words for our Husky faithful that is going to be geeked up for this South Carolina game this weekend?
I mean, get ready for a good game. I'll be covering Seton Hall, who's visiting visiting Providence, where I live this weekend. So I'll be having that on my second screen. But I'm excited to see how it goes. And yeah, I mean, let's throw the ball up and see what happens.
All right. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about it next week. Win, lose, or draw. That's T. Baker, contributor, Hoops Capital of the World, and writer for The Next, Big East beat reporter. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, asking you to stay locked in, stay connected, make sure those toughness meters are always rising. And as always, it's not how you get it done. It's about doing it in a way it can't be done any better. That's our goal every day. And go Huskies.